I'd like to welcome on Cybe Locke, our LHP chairperson, who's going to be speaking on Māori, Pacifica and women's trade union committees in the 1980s.
I'm going to change track entirely. So my talk is going to take us back to the grassroots. It's going to take us to some workers' stories, including people in this room. And I hope give us a sense of the whakapapa of the formation of trade union committees that I would argue transformed the trade union movement in the 1980s. So I want to talk about women, Māori and Pacifica members, share some of their stories and talk about how they made that even through these horrific times that have just been laid out really boldly for us, created community and changed and made unions more democratic. So if we return back to the late 70s, where the union movement was very much divided between arbitrationist unions and industrially militant unions. So the arbitrationist unions, characterised as industrially weak, members were uninvolved in union affairs, led from the top by the union officials who didn't perhaps even talk to their members about what they might want, would go and negotiate through the arbitration system on their behalf for wages and conditions. On the other hand, you've got the industrially militant unions who had very active memberships, who through the use of stop work meetings, other industrial tactics, brought workers together to discuss, set the policy, and used industrial activity to win higher wages and better conditions from employers. But as very much has been pointed out by the feisties, thank you very much, I'm hoping this paper will link in very much to what was sung to us earlier. What unions had in common is that the vast majority of them were led by white men. And this was a time when that changed. So I want to, drawing on oral interviews and union newspapers, I want to put the experiences of members involved in the Wellington Hotel and Hospital Workers Union, now E2, into conversation with the Northern Drivers Union, shop employees, butchers and grocers, stores and packers, now First Union, to explore events and processes that changed unions during the 1980s. So in that regard, I want to acknowledge John Ryle, Annie Newman, Sid Kepa, Cheryl Cadman, Lois Hampstead, Odette Shaw and Joe Taylor for your rich descriptions of these tumultuous times. So, we've had the slide already today. My colleague Jim, thank you. Māori members of the Northern Drivers Union were activated by the occupation of Bastion Point and the Auckland Trades Council green ban that was then enforced. Workers refused to do any development work on Takaparawa Bastion Point. As Sid Kepa explained to me, the green ban was initially sold to trade union members as a class issue, which to begin with was what drew Sid in. He told me Muldoon wanted to build rich people's houses on there, so that was a big draw card, not only for me, but some who were a bit iffy on Māori rights. I was going up there to support the people at Takaparawa to keep the rich white people out. But as Ngāti Whātua Ōrake's 17-month-long occupation wore on, the drivers began to discuss Māori land rights issues, the history of colonisation, through their newspapers, the Road Transport Worker, in workplace meetings. And this impacted the policy of that union on these issues. So if you look at 1977, members agreed to opposition to all forms of racial discrimination at home and abroad. By the end of the occupation 1978 conference, the policy had been extended to equality of all races and harmonious relations between all workers for mutual progress, greater involvement of Polynesian members in various positions in the union, full support for justice for the Māori people, for land rights, opposition to all forms of apartheid in any area. And if you look from 1978 onwards, Māori members were elected onto the Northern Drivers Executive in far greater numbers. Rameka Harris became an organiser in 1979. John Willis was elected union president in 1980. By the mid-1980s, 5 of the 9 paid Northern Drivers officials and 10 executive members were Māori. 1 executive member was a woman. Now, there were not very many women truck drivers. They made up about 2% of the driving workforce in the 1970s. But the early 1970s did see a few women's drivers' union delegates, and they were involved, of course, in the equal pay campaign and the women's movement. Cheryl Cadman got a truck driving job at New Zealand Tower Supply Services in the early 1980s, joining a predominantly female Māori and Pacifica workforce. She found truck driving was fun. We were all pretty young. We all liked to have a good time. We'd finish work at 2 p.m, the trucks would be hidden around the place. Well, we'd go for the pub for an hour, back to work. Stuff you'd be appalled at now. Cheryl encountered Bill Anderson at a driver's delegate meeting. She said, "I was one of 2 women at that meeting and the only female delegate. Bill was speaking on women's issues, so I knew I had to get up and speak." She recalled it was absolutely terrifying, getting up to speak in front of thousands of blokes. John Willis called me Love, and I said into my microphone, "I'd be a lot better if you didn't call me Love," which the boys loved. Everyone loved that, so that sort of broke the ice, really. So Bill encouraged Cadman to stand for the Northern Drivers Executive, and so she did that in 1985. When she got up to speak, the drivers wolf whistled. This time, Willis called for order. Cheryl said, "I got the 2nd highest polling for the executive and was never wolf whistled at again." And in 1987, she was elected a drivers' organiser. She reflected, "I was the first woman to ever be elected by drivers to work for the union. Sadly, our union has not employed another woman to represent the drivers' division since." Now, we've talked a bit about this today already, but of course I have to go out a little bit wider and look at that was taking place at the same time that wonderful women that sang to you were transforming the Federation of Labour, coming together to create that Working Women's Charter in 1977, and all of the amazing work that Sonia Davies led to get it accepted in 1980. 139 seminars of bringing people together in all kinds of ways. All of the lobbying that went on through all of the unions to get enough support to get that remit through the 1980 Federation of Labour Conference. But it was done. And despite some opposition, it was also agreed that Trades Council and Federation of Labour women's committees will be established to promote women's issues and greater women's participation and leadership. By 1984, the combined state unions had adopted that charter as well, and other sectors followed suit. Fierce lobbying again, all of that continuing organisational work by Māori and women delegates, meant that Māori and women's trade union advisory committees won the right to be represented on the Federation National Council and Executive in 1986, and these structures were kept when this Council of Trade Union was created in 1987. Again, those were all struggles that took place due to this kind of collectivism that was going on in particular unions. Female-dominated unions during the 80s adopted a strategy of implementing women's standing committees, using journals, as Grace showed you as well, but most importantly, these delegate structures to encourage participation. And the Wellington Hotel and Hospital Workers Union was one of them. Women made up 70% of the 12,000 members, and in 1979, public hospital delegates Mary Heptonstall and Liz Lelo campaigned to be elected onto the executive. Now, Mary, she was a delegate at the Porirua Hospital. She'd been in the workforce since the 1930s. She was a communist. She helped form the women's auxiliary to support families of locked out waterside workers in 1951. She explained in the union newspaper Push that she spent her whole life working, fighting class discrimination and injustice wherever she found it. Liz Lilo, affectionately known by her union comrades as Auntie Liz, had immigrated from Samoa to New Zealand in the 1950s. She became a kitchen hand at Parirua Hospital, which is where she met Mary. Liz stood up for other Pacific Island workers in the workforce when they suffered from racism from supervisors and from chefs. A classic Auntie Liz story was when she got really fed up with one particular chef who would not stop making racially abusive remarks to the Samoan kitchen hands, and she chased the chef out of the kitchen with a sharp carving knife. After that, she thought she'd better get involved in the union. Now, by 1981, Liz and Mary were successfully elected to the executive, and increasing numbers of women became delegates in that space. Union women initially campaigned for a women's subcommittee at the national level, the Hospital, Hotel and Restaurant Workers Federation as it then was, and this was done by 1985. The first annual women's seminar, funded by each union in the federation, was held that year, and issues of sexual harassment and childcare were prioritised as issues for the coming year. Women's committees were then established regionally, and Annie Newman, who some of you may know, a delegate at Nicholson's Restaurant, became the first convener of the Wellington Women's Committee. Now, inspired by this committee and the Hui Ana Kaimahi, the hui of Māori workers organised and unemployed, organised by Sir Jackson in 1986, inspired Māori and Pacifica women who'd helped form the Women's Committee to form their own committees for Māori and Pacifica members of the Hotel and Hospital Workers Union. And Marie Normal, who was Secretary of the Napier branch at that time, was very active in its formation of the Māori Committee in 1986. And again, these became regional committee as well. And they encouraged greater Māori participation and a focus on issues relevant to Māori members such as speaking te reo and tikanga. The committee sought to educate the broader union membership as well, increasing numbers of union conferences, and trainings were held on marae, building relationships between the union and local tribal elders. Marie designed a pamphlet on marae protocol, so as she put it, those workers and officials who have never experienced the spiritual wholeness of living and being as one would not feel uncomfortable. Union members were also educated on why tangihanga leave was so important, an award claim for Māori. The union committed to funding for members and officials, Māori and non-Māori, to learn te reo, and this had quite an impact. Māori union leaders Ella Davis and Pat Bolted went on to play really strong roles in the Pohanga Reo movement. Liz Lilo took the lead in organising the Pacific Island Committee in 1987. Pacific members were very careful to make sure the committees, or whanau as it came to be called, had 2 representatives from each island, Samoa, Fiji, Tonga, Rarotonga, Niue and Tukalau, and that Samoan didn't dominate, despite Samoan members being the biggest number. Pacific members were strong in the public hospitals, in that sector of the union, and they aimed to encourage that same Pacifica strength in other areas, to build confidence, build support for new arrivals from the islands. Liz Lilo, as national convener, reported on the issues that she and others were confronting in the union. She said, a lot of Pacific Island members don't know their rights. Some people say that Pacific Islanders do know what's going on and they just pretend they don't know, but things don't really register, and that also applies to job descriptions. So in response to these kinds of issues being raised, the union committed to running English language courses. The Pacific Committee also recommended the training of supervisors and managers in cultural understanding. Liz explained, our bosses and supervisors should be made aware of Pacific Island people's needs. It would avoid a lot of arguments. The whanau also recommended the union translate all its awards into Pacific Island languages. Immigration was also a hot topic for Fijian, Samoan and Tongan workers, some of whom had experienced the 1970s dawn raids carried out on suspected overstayers. Firsthand, Liz explained, our people were searched by police with dogs at all sorts of hours. They were woken from their sleep. It was very inhumane. They are still doing it, only now it's being done through the workplace. In Auckland, they go in and ask for passports. Lalupua Sanelli, a cleaner at Wellington Hospital, was active in the Pacific Island Committee and recalled when United Health took over the cleaning contract from Avalon, all the workers were told if they did not bring in their passports, they would not keep their jobs. So we rang the union and told other workers not to comply with this request for passports. The workers, with their union representatives, spent the day arguing with 2 immigration officers and 5 employers, and in the end, everyone kept their jobs and no one showed their passports. It has never left my mind how strong the union is, he said. Annie Newman reflected on how the 3 standing committees worked together on issues they shared in common. And of course, some union members were involved in all 3 of those committees. The committee strategised on how to gain speaking rights and voting rights on the Federation Management Committee. They achieved this in 1988, but it was not all plain sailing. Marie Normal explained that the Māori Committee had been criticised as racist, separatist and too radical. Arguing against this, she wrote, the Māori Committee has not been selfish in their views, nor exclusive of other cultures. What has happened is a growth of pride, confidence and spirit of many of our Māori members, firstly within themselves and then in solidarity and identity with the union. Without these qualities, the union movement can only be weakened. John Ryle recalled, we had all these debates. Some people said we are a class-based union, we don't need all these bloody sideline distractions. John countered, but they were great. Sometimes maybe we overdid it with the number of seminars and discussions on these things rather than embedding them in solid organisation that would never be knocked over, when you reflect on it. But the committees were pretty powerful, and pretty powerful people came through when you look at what they're doing now, the value they've added to themselves, to their families, to their communities. Back in Auckland, the Working Women's Resource Centre, spearheaded by Marion Street and Judy Attenberger, was established in 1984 at the Auckland Trade Union Centre. And this became another crucial support base for women's rights. The Resource Centre was premised on the idea that all women were working women and focused particularly on employment issues and the importance of trade unions. They had regular social events, which everyone went to, the top twins played, and all of the money that was raised, as well as being a social hub, right, all of the money that was raised was then used to provide the resources for the organisation. They assisted their male trade union comrades on sexual harassment cases, educating the blokes slowly, as Adette Shaw told me. The Resource Centre ran, I've said that. So all of the unions in the Trade Union Centre contributed to the Working Women's Resource Centre. But when male union leaders became too interfering, the centre was registered as an incorporated society to protect its independence. Stores and Packers Union Administrator Odette Shaw remembered there was a wonderful feeling in that trade union centre. It was a hive of industry. Every floor was full with all the different unions, apart from the hoteliers, who would come up on a Friday to the trade union centre bar. Cheryl recalled, it was really alive. People were arguing about things. It felt like you were in something really vibrant, when everyone is so passionate and great orators. But gee, there was a lot of sexism amongst those trade union centre unionists, Odette explained. But women in the movement changed that. When she got her job in 1984, she discovered the last Stores and Packers administrator had made scones and cups of tea and coffee for their union officials, Mike Jackson and Bruce Fowler, every morning. Shaw told them that would not be happening from now on and bought them a coffee machine. It took a Northern Clerical Workers Union picket outside the Labourers Union office before officials stopped expecting their administrators to make the cups of tea. Jo Taylor remembered when she first started working part-time for the Stores Union, she had a 5-month-old baby, Sophie, And her good friend Glenda Hinchy, who worked for the butchers and grocers and was also involved in the Unemployed Workers Union, would look after Sophie and bring her to Joe Taylor to breastfeed on break. She said at first male union organisers would come in and go, "Oh my God," but then it became a normal thing. Now the male-dominated Northern Drivers and Stores and Packers unions amalgamated with the female-dominated shop employees and butchers and grocers unions to form the Northern Distribution Union in 1987. So now women made up over half of the membership of that union. And so the union newspaper, New Union Express, was incredibly different to the Drivers' Union newspaper that I used earlier to tell those stories, right? Women's issues predominated. And again, those spaces were used to organise committees. A Distribution Workers Federation Women's Seminar was organised in 87. Lois Hampstead was really involved in using those democratic structures. But she was really aware that even though there were those democratic structures and there were thousands of members attending them, very few women were getting up to speak. So that those standing committees were still needed to really reinforce that participation and support that. And very few women were union officials in the retail division of that, of the union when it first started. It took hard work to convince some male officials, but everyone finally came around, and so the first Distribution Workers Federation conference was held in 1989, where delegates came together and discussed pornography, sexual harassment, Sunday trading, flexibility versus the casualisation of labour, pressure from employers to remove penal rates, redundancies and unemployment, health and safety, Māori input into the union, and pay equity, of course. As you already know, singing was an incredibly important part of this organising. Don't Be Too Polite was the theme song of this conference that we all sang earlier. Women also argued that Māori and Pacifica structures were needed in the Federation as well. And so Auckland Tuia worker Nora Rameka and Hamilton retail organiser Charlotte Reti led the way in this work. And for all of these committees, employment equity was a key issue. And it was from those collectives of support that the support for the Clerical Workers Association Employment Equity campaign, right, that was talked about earlier, came from. It generated that momentum and gave people a support base to be part of that enormous campaign, right, with the umbrella of Coalition for Equal Value, Equal Pay, to get legislation that addressed pay equity and equal employment opportunity for Māori, women, Pacific Island and disabled workers. And so I know we've gone on to talk about what happened next, but I want to stop. I want to stop in that moment when that Employment Equity Act was passed. Because we didn't know then, in 1990, what was coming next. And it was an amazing moment of success. And I think sometimes those are the things that we forget, to take a moment and say, "How we rocked it, you know? This is what we brought about." So I'm going to leave you there.